Hello there. Thank you for joining me today. This is a story that has left millions speechless. Imagine this. On a cold, rainy night in Charleston, a 68-year-old mother is locked outside her own gate by her daughter-in-law, drenched, shivering, and heartbroken, right in front of the house where she once poured all her love, care, and sacrifices. That same daughter-in-law once called her mom, kissed her hand, and promised, "I'll take care of you like my own mother." But just a few years later, she tried to take everything, the house, the money, and even the peace the old woman had left. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's a journey of standing up for justice, not through anger, but through truth. Stay until the end, because sometimes the most terrifying thing in life isn't losing everything. It's being betrayed under your own roof. I still remember the day Daniel brought her home to meet me. It was a golden autumn afternoon, the wind from the Ashley River gently sweeping across the porch. Daniel had just been promoted to chief engineer in Charleston, his face glowing as if he was bringing home the future itself. "Mom, this is Clara," he said proudly, his eyes shining as if he was introducing me to a treasure. Clara smiled and reached out her hand. "I'm so happy to meet you. Daniel has told me so much about you." Her voice was sweet like honey, her eyes clear and warm. I still remember that handshake, soft, warm, and trembling slightly. I never imagined that years later, that same hand would mock me out of the very house that once welcomed her in. In the beginning, Clara was every mother's dream daughter-in-law. She helped me cook, clean, and always called me Mom with genuine affection. Every morning, by the time I made coffee, she was already setting the table. "Mom, do you like blueberry or apple muffins?" "Apple, sweetheart." In just a few weeks, I loved her like my own daughter. Daniel was busy, often traveling for work, so the Riverside house became a home for two women, Clara and me. She was chatty, cheerful, and had a way of making me feel young again. We painted the fence together, replanted the white roses my late husband used to adore. For the first time in years, I felt peace in my heart. Then the small changes began. She said the living room looked a bit outdated, wanted to repaint it a brighter color. I nodded. She moved our wedding photo to another spot for better lighting. I nodded again. When she suggested selling my husband's vintage car to make room for the Tesla, I still smiled. "If it makes things easier, go ahead, dear." I didn't realize that every yes I gave was one step further out of my own life. One night, I overheard her in the kitchen. "Daniel's mom living alone in that big house is such a waste. Just give me a little time. I'll convince her." Her voice sounded nothing like the Clara I knew, sharp, fast, and calculating. When I walked in, she flashed a quick smile. "Oh, Mom, I was just talking to a friend. Don't misunderstand." I said nothing, only looked at her, and in that glance, I caught something cold flicker in her eyes. The next morning, she brought fresh flowers to my room, her sweet daughter-in-law self again. "Mom, I was thinking, this house is too big for you. Maybe we could rent out the lower floor. I'll handle everything for you." I smiled politely. "You're so thoughtful." But something inside me started to ache. As months passed, Clara became more helpful. Everything in the house was under her control. I no longer kept the keys. "It's easier if I hold them, Mom." Bills, taxes, insurance, she handled it all. I started to feel like a guest in my own home. One evening, Olivia, my longtime neighbor, stopped by with a basket of muffins. "Such a nice daughter-in-law you've got," she said softly. "But Margaret, don't let her handle all your house papers." In America, whoever holds the documents holds the power. I chuckled. Clara's just helping me. Olivia gave me a knowing look, sighed. Help is fine, but make sure everything's in black and white. Her words haunted me all night. The next day, Clara came in holding a stack of papers. Mom, I talked to the insurance company. They just need your signature so we can fix the roof before the rainy season. She smiled warmly, handing me a pen. I was about to sign when Olivia walked in again, carrying peach jam. She glanced at the papers and frowned. Why does a roof repair contract include a mortgage transfer clause? The air froze. Clara laughed nervously. Oh, that must be a mix-up. Wrong form. She quickly gathered the documents and left. I said nothing, but for the first time I felt unsafe in my own house. That night, while washing dishes, I heard her whispering on the phone again. She's suspicious now, but I'll handle it. Once Daniel agrees, everything will be ours. The glass slipped from my hand and shattered. She turned around, startled, but I just murmured, Sorry, I'm clumsy. I couldn't sleep. I looked around. Every corner of the house bore Clara's touch. The flowers, the curtains, the wooden floors, even the faint scent of her perfume. I realized this house no longer felt like mine. The next morning, she smiled as if nothing had happened. Good morning, Mom. Did you sleep well? Yes, I replied. But inside, I knew a storm was coming. I gazed out at the sunlight glimmering on the river, the same place where I used to stand with my husband, where Daniel once played as a boy. Now, only silence remained. And in that silence, I made a promise to myself. If peace can be stolen, then I must learn how to take it back. If you've ever met someone who made you question your own kindness, hit like and comment 1, so I'll know you understand exactly how that feels. And just as I feared, that storm came faster than I ever imagined. Clara started speaking differently. No more Mom in the mornings. Instead, she'd say, Margaret, your coffee's on the table, in a flat, emotionless tone. When Daniel was away on business, the house turned heavy and silent. The sound of a knife hitting the cutting board, a glass placed too hard on the table. Small sounds, but they make me feel like a stranger in my own kitchen. One morning, I found her rummaging through the drawer that held my late husband's papers. I'm just looking for the insurance forms, don't worry, she said, without meeting my eyes. I saw her slip a few sheets into her pocket. I didn't say a word. I didn't have the strength to fight. That afternoon, Olivia stopped by with a fresh apple pie. She saw Clara on the porch whispering into her phone, her tones sharp and calculating. If she doesn't sign soon, I'll wait until she gets weaker. Then I can apply for guardianship. The law makes it easy here. Olivia turned to me, her face pale. Honey, she's talking about you. I froze. That night, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the family photos on the wall. Daniel at age 10, my husband in his uniform, me in my old floral dress. I wondered what my husband would say if he were here. Maybe he'd just put a hand on my shoulder and whisper, "Don't be afraid." Let the truth speak for itself. The next morning, Clara made an elaborate breakfast, as if to erase all doubts. After we ate, she brought me a folder. Mom, I spoke with the insurance company. They said we should update the house ownership paperwork to make things clear. It's just a formality. Doesn't change anything. I looked at her and smiled faintly. Are you sure, dear? She nodded, her smile radiant. Of course, I'd never do anything to hurt you. I picked up the pen, my hand trembling, but Olivia's voice echoed in my mind. Help is fine, but in black and white, everything must be clear. I said softly, let me read through it first. Clara's shoulders stiffened. Don't you trust me, Mom? That sentence, short, gentle, felt like a velvet threat. I folded the papers and said, when Daniel comes home, we'll look at it together. Her eyes hardened. She didn't speak, only gave a thin smile and walked away. The sound of her heels on the wooden floor echoed like a ticking clock counting down. That night, Daniel called. "Mom, Clara said you don't want to sign the refinance papers?" "It's just a routine process. I trust her. She wouldn't mean any harm." I replied quietly, "Son, sometimes even trust needs to be protected by reason." There was silence. Then Daniel sighed. "I understand, but please don't make things harder than they need to be." After the call, a deep heaviness settled over me. I knew Daniel loved his wife, and I didn't want to be the reason their marriage cracked. But I also knew if I stayed silent, there would be nothing left to protect. A few days later, Clara brought a bouquet of white roses. "I'm sorry, Mom. Maybe I rushed things. We're just trying to plan for the future." I smiled. "Thank you, dear. But remember, my future is still mine to decide." Her eyes flickered for a second. Then she quickly changed the subject. "Would you like to change the curtains? Beige would brighten up the room." I nodded, too tired to argue. After that, it all felt like a chess game. She changed things one by one. The paint color, the decor, even the wall calendar. Everywhere I went, I felt her watchful eyes on me, making sure I stayed within her lines. One night, I overheard her again in the kitchen. "If she signs, I'll transfer everything into Daniel's name. After that, I can take care of the rest." My heart pounded. Then I understood. She didn't want family. She wanted ownership. I went upstairs, opened my husband's old drawer, and found his notebook, the one he used when he traveled. In the middle of it, he had written a single line: "Never sign when your heart is trembling." I closed the book. And in that moment, I knew I wouldn't be signing anything ever again. The next morning, Clara cheerfully handed me a cup of coffee. "Mom, I've scheduled a realtor to appraise the house." "You should be happy. Your property's value is going up." I looked at her calmly. "Are you sure it's my property we're talking about?" She froze for half a second, then laughed. "Of course it's yours. But soon it'll be ours, right?" I said nothing. In the silence, I heard the faint drip of water from the upstairs shower, each drop ticking away the time I had left before losing everything. The next day, Olivia came by again. After I told her everything, she looked at me sternly. "You can't keep trusting blindly, honey. At our age, we don't need to prove we're kind. We just need to prove we're not easy to fool." I gripped her hand. "Olivia, I've let her go too far." That night, I lay awake listening to the wind. Clara's shadow passed across the hallway wall, silent, smooth, predatory. I realized that if I didn't act soon, she'd walk through that door one day holding the deed to my house. It was time to find Garrison, my late husband's old lawyer friend. But before leaving the room, I turned toward the wedding photo on the wall. My husband's eyes, frozen in time, seemed to look right at me, calm, steady, and full of faith, as if saying, "Don't be afraid." I smiled faintly. Maybe he was right. If you've ever had to choose between trust and reason, what would you do? Would you listen to your heart or your instincts? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know which side you'd take. I went to see Garrison the next morning. He was still the same silver-haired man, calm voice, sharp eyes. He had been my husband's closest friend, and the only person I truly trusted. After listening to everything, he sat quietly for a moment, then said slowly, "Margaret, your daughter-in-law doesn't just want the house. She's testing how weak you are. But you're lucky. You haven't lost anything yet. The house is still under the family trust. As long as you don't sign, no one can take it." I felt a wave of relief, mixed with sadness. Once I had loved Clara like a daughter. Now I was sitting in a lawyer's office trying to protect myself from her. I didn't want to believe it, but the truth was no longer hiding. Garrison looked at me. Do you want me to step in right now? I shook my head. Not yet. I want to see how far she's willing to go. That afternoon, Clara came home smiling, as if nothing had happened. Mom, I have good news. Daniel and I are thinking about buying a condo downtown. If you agree to rent out the lower floor, the rent could help us pay the mortgage. You'd even have extra income. I smiled gently. That's a nice idea, dear. But you don't have to worry about me. I already have enough. She hesitated, then softened her voice. I just want you to be comfortable. But in her eyes, I no longer saw care, only calculation. The days that followed felt like watching a stranger rearrange my life. Clara called painters, decorators, contractors. She repainted the living room, replaced the curtains, moved the furniture, even cleared away my husband's memorial corner. When I asked why, she said lightly, I just want the house to feel brighter, more modern. I answered, this house was already beautiful, Clara. It holds my memories with Daniel's father. She smiled without meeting my eyes. It's time to let go of the past, Mom. You should learn how to move on. Those words cut deeper than I expected. Daniel seemed unaware of what was really happening. Whenever I tried to talk to him, he'd say, Don't worry, Mom. Clara only means well, but I could see the strain in his eyes, exhaustion, debt, and something he wasn't telling me. One evening, Clara invited me to dinner. The table was set perfectly. Red wine, candles, music. I know things have been tense lately, she said sweetly, so I wanted us to have dinner together like before. I smiled, thinking maybe she wanted to make peace. But halfway through the meal, Clara looked up and said casually, Mom, Daniel and I have been talking. We think you should consider living at a retirement community in Mount Pleasant. It's lovely there. Doctors on site, people your age, activities every day. We can manage the house for you. Take care of the taxes, the repairs. You won't have to worry about anything. I set my wine glass down slowly. What did you just say? Her tone stayed calm. I just want you to rest and live comfortably. Daniel added quietly, Mom, Claire is right. You'd have friends there. Here, you're all alone. I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, the one whose first steps I once guided, now sitting beside a woman who wanted me gone. I opened my mouth to speak, but my throat closed. Dinner ended in silence. Later, from my room, I heard them whispering in the kitchen. You did the right thing, Daniel. She needs to let go. But she's my mother. That's why you have to do it now. If you don't, you'll never have your own life. Tears slipped down my face. So that's what I had become, an obstacle to their happiness. The next morning, there was a paper waiting for me on the dining table. Long-term care proposal. Clara explained brightly, This is just information about the senior community. I've already called them. It's wonderful, Mom. We'll visit next week. I didn't respond. I simply folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. That afternoon, Olivia came over and found me sitting quietly on the porch. When I told her everything, she shook her head. Margaret, this isn't about being a good or bad daughter-in-law anymore. This is about someone trying to take your life's control. If you don't protect yourself, no one will. I gave a faint smile. Olivia, I don't want to fight. I just want peace. She placed her hand on my shoulder. Peace doesn't come by waiting. You have to take it back. That night, I sat in my husband's old study, the one place Clara hadn't touched. Inside the drawer were all the important documents, the house deed, trust records, and a copy of his will. I remembered Garrison's words, never sign when your heart is trembling. Now, my hands were steady. I wasn't trembling anymore. The next morning, Clara brought my coffee and smiled. Mom, if you really decide to move out, would you like to leave a few of your old things behind? I looked up. Of course, dear. I'll just keep the piano. Oh, and I'd like to look over the house papers one last time before signing anything. Her eyes lit up. She tried to hide it, but I saw. I knew you'd come around, Mom. You always do. But what she didn't know was that I was ready. I had already scanned every document and met Garrison again to file legal confirmation of ownership. I stayed quiet, waiting for the right moment. That evening, Clara hosted a small party for her friends. She wore a red dress, poured wine, laughed loudly, in my house, calling it our new home. Watching her, I felt something inside me harden. Everything I had built, everything I had loved, had become a backdrop for someone else's performance. But I wasn't afraid anymore, because I knew things were about to change. I looked out the window as the sunset glowed across the river, its light painting the walls crimson. And I whispered to myself, starting tomorrow, no one will ever take what's mine again. If you've ever been pushed out of the place you once called home, tell me how it felt. And if you want to stand with me till the very end of this story, don't forget to subscribe, because the next part will show you that sometimes justice begins the moment you finally say, enough. The next morning, I brought the folder to see Garrison. His office was a small corner room near the old pier in Charleston, the kind of place where retirees met for coffee and stories about the past. He went through every document carefully, nodding. Good, he said. You've kept these in perfect order. This is solid evidence. The entire property is under the family trust your husband created. You're the sole beneficiary. Daniel and his wife can't touch a cent without your signature. I gripped his hand, feeling a heavy weight lift from my chest. But I don't want a lawsuit, I whispered. I just want them to stop. Garrison smiled softly. You won't need one. Just stay quiet at the right moment. Greed always exposes itself. I returned home with a strange mix of calm and tension. Clara was in the living room, speaking to a man in a suit. When she saw me, she chirped, Mom, I invited someone to inspect the house's structure. You know, old homes like this need evaluation for refinancing. It'll help you lower property taxes. I stood still. Lower taxes? Or list it for sale? She laughed. Oh, Mom, you're funny. Who sells before finding a buyer? The man walked around, asking about square footage and the year the house was built, snapping photos as he went. I realized immediately, he wasn't a contractor. He was a real estate appraiser. After they left, I asked quietly, Clara, what exactly are you planning to do with this house? She kept her eyes on her phone, just checking its value. You should be happy, Mom. Your property's worth over $1 million now. I nodded, but my heart felt frozen. That night, I called Garrison and told him everything. He answered firmly, Don't stop her. Let her dig her own hole. I'll prepare copies of the trust and the evidence. When she crosses the line, we'll strike. I hesitated. If I stay silent, won't it be too late? Garrison said, Sometimes silence is the only thing that makes a liar speak. The next day, Clara hosted what she called a family dinner. She made Daniel's favorite dishes, poured red wine, played soft jazz. As soon as I sat down, she smiled warmly. Mom, I want to have an honest talk. Daniel and I have decided, if you agree, we should sell this house and move to a luxury condo in Mount Pleasant. There's 24-hour security, medical services, and no maintenance worries. You'll live in comfort. I asked quietly, And you and Daniel? She grinned. We'll stay with you, at least for a while. I looked at my son. Daniel didn't meet my eyes. He just kept eating, silently. I knew then he understood everything, but he didn't have the courage to face it. I took a deep breath. Thank you, Clara. But I'm not ready to leave. This is where your father-in-law lived. It's where I belong. The air around us went still. Clara set down her glass, her voice crisp and cold. Mom, Sometimes older people hold on too tightly. If you keep clinging to the past, who's going to take care of your future? I met her gaze. My future isn't in your hands. Daniel finally stood up, sighing. Enough. Let's not fight. Dinner ended in silence. From my room, I heard the faint murmur of their voices downstairs. You did the right thing, Daniel. She needs to let go. But she's my mother. That's why you need to do it now. Otherwise, you'll never have your own life. Tears rolled down my face. So that's what I was to them. An obstacle. Nothing more. The next morning, a new paper lay on the dining table. Long-term care proposal. Clara beamed. This is the retirement center I mentioned. It's wonderful, Mom. I'll take you there next week. I said nothing, only folded the paper and tucked it into my pocket. Later that day, Olivia visited and found me sitting blankly on the porch. When I told her everything, she frowned. Margaret, this isn't just a bad daughter-in-law anymore. This is someone trying to take away your right to live your own life. If you don't protect yourself, nobody will. I smiled sadly. I don't want to fight, Olivia. I just want peace. She squeezed my shoulder. Peace isn't given, honey. You have to take it back. That night, I went into my late husband's study, the only room Clara hadn't dared to touch. In the drawer were all the papers he left, the deed, the trust files, and a copy of his will. I remembered Garrison's words, never sign when your heart is trembling, and this time my heart was steady. The next morning, Clara came with my coffee and asked sweetly, "If you really decide to move out, Mom, can we keep a few of your old things, just for memory's sake?" I smiled. "Of course, dear. I'll just keep the piano. Oh, and I'd like to look over the house papers one more time before signing anything." Her eyes lit up. She tried to hide it, but I saw it. "I knew you'd understand, Mom." What she didn't know was that I had already scanned every document, met Garrison again, and filed the legal trust confirmation. I said nothing. I was just waiting for her final move. That evening, Clara hosted another small gathering, laughing in her red dress, pouring wine, calling my house our new home. Watching her, I felt cold but not weak, because I knew exactly what tomorrow would bring. The next morning, she said brightly, "Mom, I've set up an appointment with the realtor to take pictures of the house. They'll be here Saturday morning." I smiled. "Thank you, dear. I'll be here to welcome them." She didn't know that Garrison would also be there, with the trust documents, a notary, and a representative from the court. That night, I stood by the window, watching the light glow from Daniel's room. I heard Clara's voice through the thin walls. "Once she signs, it's over. I can handle it." I closed my eyes, breathing deeply. I wasn't angry anymore, just sad. Sad to watch someone dig their own grave, and I thought of you, the one listening to this story. Maybe somewhere out there there's another mother or father who once trusted too much, who loved too deeply and got hurt for it. If you know that feeling, leave a comment that says, "I understand," because sometimes the truth only gains its power when we finally speak it aloud. Saturday morning, the Charleston sky hung low, heavy with gray clouds. A cold wind blew from the Ashley River, carrying the damp scent of rain. I woke early, brewed my coffee, and steadied myself for a morning I knew would change everything. At exactly 9 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Clara opened it, cheerful as ever. "Good morning. Please come in. This is the house I'd like you to photograph." I stood behind her, calm and silent, watching. The man with the camera glanced around, asking, "Whose name is on the deed, ma'am?" Clara replied quickly, "It's under my mother-in-law's name, but we're in the process of transferring it. I just want a proper valuation before the paperwork is finalized." That was the moment I knew Garrison had been right. She'd gone too far. Minutes later, another car pulled up outside the gate. Garrison stepped out, carrying a leather folder, accompanied by a gray-suited man, a representative from the county court. Clara's face drained of color. What's he doing here? I said softly. Oh, just making sure everything about this house stays legal. Garrison smiled politely. Good morning, Mrs. Clara. I'm the legal representative for Mrs. Hayes. We're here to officially verify property ownership and prevent any confusion in upcoming transactions. Clara forced a smile. Confusion? This is just a family matter. Garrison replied evenly. Precisely why it needs to be clear. He opened the folder and read aloud, his voice steady and deliberate. According to the family trust established by the late Mr. Edward Hayes in 1986, all assets, including this riverside property, are held in lifetime trust for Mrs. Margaret Hayes. No other party may sell, refinance, or transfer ownership without written authorization signed before witnesses and a notary. Any attempt to use or pledge this property unlawfully is subject to prosecution. The room froze. The photographer awkwardly backed away toward the door. Clara stood motionless, her hand gripping her coffee mug so tightly it cracked in half. A splash of dark coffee stained her blouse, but she didn't move. Her eyes met mine, stripped of all pretense for the first time. Clara, I said gently, you can still stop before this goes any further. She drew a shaky breath. You don't understand. I only did this to help Daniel pay off his debts. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. Garrison's tone remained calm. If that were true, you wouldn't have submitted the house as collateral. I have a copy of the document you sent to Coastal Finance, complete with your digital signature. Her face went pale. Who gave you the right to see that? The bank, Garrison answered smoothly. At the court's request for legal verification. Daniel came down the stairs, disheveled, dark circles under his eyes. What's going on? He asked. I turned toward him, trying to keep my voice steady. Daniel, I didn't want to say this in front of you, but your wife filed a mortgage using this house without any legal right. If Garrison hadn't discovered it in time, the bank could have foreclosed. Daniel blinked in shock, then looked at Clara. Is that true? Clara burst into tears. I did it for you! I was trying to save us! If I hadn't, we would have lost everything! Watching them, I felt something bittersweet, a deep ache, yet an even deeper relief. Garrison began gathering his papers. Mrs. Hayes, we'll file for a temporary freeze order within 24 hours to prevent any unauthorized actions. The property will be officially recorded under legal protection. You retain full rights, and they'll need to vacate the premises until the case is resolved. I nodded. Clara screamed. You're kicking us out of this house? I replied quietly, with a calm I didn't know I possessed. No, I'm simply reclaiming the space that was already mine. Daniel lowered his head and said nothing. That afternoon, they left. No tears, no goodbyes, just the sound of wind moving through the porch and wet footprints fading across the wooden floor. When the gate closed behind them, I sat down on the sofa, listening to the stillness. The house felt peaceful again, but not joyful. Peace, I realized, could be heartbreakingly lonely. That night, the rain came. It tapped against the window like the quiet voice of the past. I stood, opened the window, and let the cool air in. The scent of wet roses drifted through, and in the reflection of the glass I saw myself, older, smaller, but steadier than ever. My phone buzzed. A message from Garrison. All documents are sealed. Clara has no remaining legal claim. You can rest easy now. And I typed back 2 simple words. Thank you. Lightning flashed over the river, lighting up the room. I sat at the piano, placing my hands on the keys. Soft notes filled the air, low, somber, but clear, like the breath of someone who had just escaped a trap. I didn't cry. I simply whispered, "Edward, I did it." Our home is still ours. Outside, the rain kept falling, steady and endless. But inside, something else had finally stopped. My fear. What remained was quiet strength. I knew this wasn't the end. My son was still torn between love and guilt. Clara would not give up easily. But at least now, I had my ground, legally and within myself. I poured a cup of tea and watched the rain slide down the glass. And in that moment, I understood. Peace isn't the absence of storms. Peace is learning how to stand firm through them. If you've ever had to fight to protect what's yours, your home, your dignity, or just a small piece of peace, share your story below. Because maybe, just maybe, your voice is exactly what someone out there needs to hear tonight. 3 days later, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. A smooth but icy female voice said, "Mrs. Hayes, this is attorney Lauren Pierce, representing Miss Clara Dawson. My client claims you've unlawfully seized joint marital property between her and Mr. Daniel Hayes. She demands that you return usage rights to the Riverside home within 7 days." I paused, then asked calmly, "Seized? This house belongs to the family trust. You're aware of that, aren't you?" Her tone stiffened. "Under South Carolina law, marital assets can be reconsidered if there's proof of contribution from either spouse. We have evidence showing Daniel provided financial support toward the property for several years." I laughed softly. "Financial support? Would you like me to send you the statements showing all the credit card debts I paid off for them?" The call ended, but I knew this was just the beginning. Clara wasn't finished. That afternoon, Garrison came over carrying a thick folder. "I figured she'd try legal pressure next," he said. "So we go one step ahead." I asked, "What step?" He replied, "You go public." I looked up at him. "Public? You mean tell everything?" He nodded. "Exactly. You show what you've done for your son. Every check, every bill, every sacrifice. When truth stands in the light, lies have nowhere to hide." That night, I opened every folder, every bank statement. Each number, each payment was proof of a mother's love and of her blindness. For over 3 years, I had helped Daniel, paid off credit cards, insurance bills, even covered part of the wedding that Clara's parents had promised to handle. I picked up the last transfer slip. $4,800 for wedding expenses. I remembered my hand trembling as I signed it. Now I understood. That was the last time I still believed Clara could change. I didn't sleep that night. The river outside kept its rhythm, waves tapping against the shore like the slow heartbeat of memory. I thought of Daniel, the little boy who once stood on the porch, laughing as his father taught him to drive. Where was he now? Thinking of his mother, or listening to his wife's lawyer preparing to sue me. The next morning, the Charleston Post headline hit me like a gust of wind. Elderly woman accused of seizing son's property. Legal dispute shocks Riverside neighborhood. Beneath it was a photo of Daniel and me at his wedding, one Clara must have sent herself. I stared at it for a long time. Then, strangely, I felt lighter, because the truth had begun to surface. 3 days later, I decided I wouldn't hide anymore. I invited the press to my home, They arrived with cameras, microphones, and blinding lights. At first, my voice trembled, but the more I spoke, the steadier it became. I told them everything: the betrayal, the eviction attempt, the forged mortgage papers. A reporter asked, "Mrs. Hayes, do you regret airing your family's private matters?" I looked straight into the camera. Regret? If silence means losing my dignity, then no. I don't regret a thing. The interview spread faster than I expected. People in Charleston shared it across social media. Hundreds of comments poured in. I was kicked out by my daughter-in-law too. Thank you, Mrs. Hayes, for speaking for us. I stand with Mrs. Hayes. No one should steal peace from someone who gave their whole life to family. That evening, Daniel called. His voice was tired, almost broken. "Mom, why did you have to do that? You made everyone laugh at me." I said softly, "No one's laughing at you, Daniel. They're just seeing the truth for the first time." He hesitated. "Clara says you're doing this for revenge." I smiled faintly. If justice is revenge, then maybe I'm guilty. When the call ended, I sat quietly, knowing he was torn between love and guilt. Sometimes, people only realize what they've lost when it's gone. Later that night, Olivia stopped by with a fresh apple pie. She set it on the table and said, "The whole neighborhood's talking about you, Margaret. Everyone's proud. They say you're brave." I chuckled, slicing the pie. Brave? Maybe I just ran out of fear. The next morning, Garrison called. "Good news," he said. "Clara's team just withdrew the lawsuit. They're asking for mediation instead." I asked, "And if I refuse?" "Then we win outright." But honestly, let them crumble on their own. They're drowning in debt. We don't need to strike. They'll collapse by themselves. Around noon, I drove out to Sullivan's Island. The sky was clear, the waves white with foam. I stood barefoot on the sand, letting the wind whip through my hair. I thought of it all. My husband, my years of silence, my son, and the woman who had forced me to rediscover my own strength. And I realized something. I didn't hate Clara anymore. I just pitied her for believing that money could buy power inside a home built on love. As for me, the only thing worth keeping was peace. When I got home that evening, an envelope waited by the door. Inside was a handwritten note, Daniel's handwriting. "Mom, I was wrong. I knew what Clara was doing, but I was too weak to stop it. I'm sorry for making you suffer. I don't know how to make it right, but I want to try." I sat down, reading the words over and over. Tears blurred the ink. Too late, perhaps. But Daniel had finally awakened. That night, I opened the piano again and played the old melody Edward used to love. The notes were heavy with sadness, but also healing, because this time I wasn't playing to mourn. I was playing to let go. And in that quiet, I understood. Life isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming yourself, piece by piece, note by note. If you've ever had to choose between keeping peace through silence or keeping dignity through truth, which would you choose? Share your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes a single, honest voice can give strength to someone standing at the same crossroads I once faced. I stood by the window, watching the moon cast a faint glow over the Ashley River. The wind mingled with the sound of crickets, a strange, peaceful rhythm that almost felt like music. Then, within that stillness, I heard footsteps outside. Something instinctive made me pull the curtain aside, and my heart clenched. Clara. She stood in the yard, wearing a black coat, hair disheveled, her face hollow and pale. I opened the door before she could ring the bell. "What are you doing here?" I asked, calm but cautious. She looked around, as if afraid of being seen.
Mom, I just want to talk.
It's late, Clara. There's nothing left to say. Please. Her voice trembled. I know I was wrong, but you don't understand. I'm desperate. Daniel left me. Everyone's turned against me because of you. I looked at the face that once lit up my home with laughter, now drained of life. Clara, I said softly, you did that to yourself. She broke down. I know, but I'm scared, Mom. I've lost everything. No family, no friends. I just want to start over. I stared into her eyes I once trusted, eyes that used to seem full of warmth. Now I saw only fear of abandonment. I'm not throwing you out, I said quietly, but I can't give you what you're asking for. Peace doesn't come from taking what isn't yours. She sobbed. You used to be kind. What happened to you? I sighed, tired but steady. I learned that if you're soft forever, people start thinking your heart is a place they can walk over. She turned and walked away into the rain, her small figure fading under the streetlight. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind sweep through the porch. The next morning, I met Garrison at a small cafe by the docks. He looked concerned. I heard Clara's hiring a new lawyer. She might strike back. I nodded. Let her. I'm not afraid anymore, but I want to be ready. Ready for what? I'm taking this to court, Garrison. I want it ended, legally and clean. No more compromise, no more halfway peace. He studied me for a long moment, then said quietly, You understand that means facing your son in court, too. I've already faced worse, I replied. I've watched him stay silent while his wife humiliated me. That afternoon, Garrison helped me sign the official filing, not for ownership, but to clear my name. This isn't a property case anymore, he said as I signed the last page. It's a case about dignity. I nodded. Exactly. 2 weeks later, the Charleston courthouse was unusually crowded. Reporters filled the hallway, my interview still a topic of town gossip. When I entered the courtroom, Daniel was already there, looking exhausted. Clara sat beside him, pale, her dark dress immaculate, her pride barely holding her together. The judge's voice cut through the murmurs. We are here today to review Mrs. Margaret Hayes's petition concerning allegations of property seizure brought by her son and daughter-in-law. Clara's lawyer stood up. Your Honor, we have evidence that Mr. Daniel Hayes contributed financially to the maintenance of the house for several years. Mrs. Hayes exploited his trust to seize what should be considered joint marital property. Garrison rose calmly. Your Honor, here are the verified bank records showing that, for 5 consecutive years, Mrs. Hayes personally paid all debts, including the couple's credit cards, insurance premiums, and even their wedding expenses. Additionally, the property in question is protected under a family trust, notarized in 1986, which legally excludes it from marital assets. The judge reviewed the documents for several minutes, then looked up. Miss Dawson, do you have any additional evidence? Clara's hands shook. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. Her lawyer interjected quickly. We have a witness, a neighbor who can attest that Mrs. Hayes exhibited erratic behavior, calling into question her mental competence during the signing of key documents. I smiled faintly and turned toward the courtroom doors. Then let's hear from the witness. The doors opened, and Olivia walked in. Gasps rippled through the room. Clara froze. Olivia stepped forward, voice clear and firm. I am the witness, and I can confirm that Mrs. Hayes is perfectly sound of mind. In fact, I personally saw Ms. Dawson bring an appraiser into the property without permission. The judge leaned forward. You're willing to testify to that? Yes, Your Honor. I also have video footage from my porch camera taken that morning. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Clara turned ghost white, glancing desperately at Daniel. But he just bowed his head, fists clenched. Garrison handed the USB drive to the clerk. The footage played. Clara leading the appraiser through the rooms, pointing, discussing sale timelines. Her voice rang clearly. "If I can get her to sign, you can list it next month." The judge struck the gavel. "That's enough. I've seen and heard sufficient evidence. Mrs. Hayes is not guilty of any wrongdoing. In fact, she is the victim of domestic financial abuse. The court recognizes her as the sole lifetime beneficiary of the property under the family trust. All claims from the defendants are hereby dismissed." The room fell silent. I looked at Daniel. Tears shimmered in his eyes. Clara collapsed back into her chair, her face empty, her lips trembling. When I stepped outside, reporters crowded around me. "Mrs. Hayes, do you have any statement?" one asked. I answered quietly, "No one deserves to be dismissed just because they're kind, and no one can steal peace from someone who gave them everything." Later that afternoon, when I returned home, an unmarked envelope lay on the table. Inside was an old photo. Me, Daniel, and Edward at the pier years ago. On the back, written in Daniel's shaky handwriting, were the words, "You're the only one who never gave up on me." I placed the photo on the piano, then sat down and pressed my fingers against the worn keys. The melody that came wasn't sad anymore. It was soft, alive, full of breath. And in that moment, I understood. Some battles aren't about defeating anyone. They're about finding your way back to yourself. The piano's final note faded, leaving only a soft echo hanging in the air. I smiled faintly, but my heart was not yet calm. Even though the court had ruled in my favor, deep down, I knew women like Clara never stopped. When the truth humiliates them, they always find another way, darker, sharper, to regain control. And I was right. 3 days later, Garrison called, his voice low. "Margaret, there's trouble. Clara just hired a psychologist to submit a report claiming you show signs of cognitive decline. They're requesting a retrial and a competency evaluation." I froze for a moment. "She still won't stop?" "No," he said, "but don't worry. We'll counter her with the truth." That evening, I sat alone at the dining table, the house quiet around me. I thought of Edward, of how he once taught me to tell who was trustworthy. A liar will always hide behind paperwork. The honest prove themselves through actions. He'd been right. I didn't need to argue. I needed to act. The next morning, I visited my personal doctor for a full physical and mental evaluation. When the results came back, the doctor smiled. "Mrs. Hayes, you have the health of a 55-year-old. No cognitive issues at all. You're sharper than most people your age." I laughed softly. Good. Because someone's trying to prove the opposite. That afternoon, Garrison organized a private press briefing. He spoke firmly. "No one can diagnose mental health without direct evaluation. Mrs. Hayes has voluntarily undergone testing, and the results prove she's fully competent. We'll file a countersuit for defamation." The news spread like wildfire. Hundreds of comments appeared online. "They're not just greedy, they're cruel. I went through the same thing. Thank you for standing up, Mrs. Hayes." That night, my phone rang. Daniel's number. His voice was rough, tired. "Mom, I don't know what to say. Clara's gone too far. She said if I don't support her claim, she'll leave and take everything." I sighed. "Daniel, can't you see? That's not love. That's control. You can't save someone by burning yourself down." "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. "I want to come home, but I'm afraid you won't forgive me." "The door's never been locked," I said gently. but you'll have to walk in as a man who owns his mistakes." The next morning, Daniel appeared at the gate, holding a small suitcase. He stood there for a long time before saying quietly, "Mom, can I stay a few days? I need to understand what I've lost." I didn't answer, just opened the door. The house, once silent, finally breathed again. In the days that followed, Daniel fixed the porch, mowed the grass, repainted the fence. His eyes softened, his defenses lowered. Sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom to finally look up. One afternoon, while we were rearranging the living room, Daniel said quietly, "Mom, I heard Clara's been contacting our old neighbors, trying to pay them to testify you were unstable." I looked up, and what can they even say? She told them she'd pay well. "Some might take it," I smiled, calm and steady. "Then we'll teach her one last lesson, the power of truth." 3 days later, Garrison and I sent letters to everyone Clara had approached. No threats, just a reminder. If you provide false testimony, Mrs. Hayes reserves the right to pursue perjury and defamation charges. By nightfall, 8 people withdrew. The remaining 2, both witnesses to Clara's earlier outburst in my garden, recorded video statements in my defense. One of them even said on camera, "I used to think Mrs. Hayes was weak. Now I see. She was just choosing not to fight dirty." When we filed the countersuit, Garrison looked at me. "If this goes all the way, Clara could lose everything. Her assets, her credibility." I stared out the window. I don't need her to lose money. I just want her to understand what it feels like when someone steals your peace. 2 weeks later, the retrial came and went quickly. The doctor Clara had paid confessed to taking money for a fabricated report. The headlines exploded across Charleston. Garrison told me I didn't have to attend, but I went anyway. Not for revenge, but for closure. When the judge announced the sentence, 18 months probation for falsifying records and defamation, I only nodded. No applause, no gloating, just a quiet breeze through the courtroom windows, carrying the faint scent of salt from the sea. Clara hung her head, tears streaking down her face. I stepped forward and whispered, "I'm not happy to see you punished, Clara. But I hope that when you leave this place, you'll finally learn how to live without hurting others." She looked up, eyes hollow. "Do you think I ever had another choice?" I answered softly, "There's always a choice. You just never made one." Outside, the afternoon sun poured golden light across the old streets of Charleston. Daniel walked beside me, silent until we reached the gate.
Mom, he said, how do you stay so calm?
I smiled. Because I've learned, anger doesn't heal anything. It only deepens the wound. That night, I sat by the river, listening to the waves lapping against the shore. For the first time in years, I felt true peace. Not the fragile kind born from silence, but the deep kind that comes from understanding. Maybe forgiveness isn't weakness. Maybe it's the final victory. I looked up at the sky and whispered, "Edward, do you see? Peace finally came home, even if it took a lifetime." If you've ever faced betrayal yet still chose forgiveness, leave a heart or simply write, "I understand," because sometimes even the smallest bit of empathy can help someone else survive the storm, just like it once did for me. I understand. Such a simple phrase. Yet as I read the comments beneath my story, tears welled in my eyes. Thousands of strangers had written those same 2 words. I understand. Some were single mothers. Some were women in their 80s, abandoned by their children. Some were sons who'd once been blinded by pride. And somehow, all of them were reaching out to me, offering the same thing, compassion. For the first time, I didn't feel alone. I used to think I was just an old woman who'd been betrayed, But now I realized my story was a mirror for countless others. One morning, Daniel walked into the living room holding a cup of coffee. "Mom," he said, "I just watched your latest interview. People are calling you a symbol of resilience. Did you know that?" I smiled. "I don't need titles, Daniel. I just want you to learn one thing. Never let anyone teach you to love through fear." He sat beside me, eyes heavy. "I know. I lived in fear for so long, afraid of losing the house, afraid of losing my wife, afraid of being judged. And in the end, I lost you." I placed my hand on his shoulder. "You never lost me, son. You just had to wander far enough to find your own lesson." From that day on, Daniel stayed with me. He found work again at a small engineering firm and came home early each night so we could share dinner. Our evenings grew peaceful, just the two of us on the porch, listening to the river breeze. Life felt quiet again, until one April afternoon when the mailman handed me a thick envelope. It was a letter from Clara. The handwriting trembled, the words unsteady. Written, she said, from a correctional facility in Greenville. "Mrs. Hayes, I know you don't want to hear from me, but these nights here have made me think. I spent years blaming everyone, Daniel, fate, even you, but never once did I look at myself. My greed blinded me. I thought owning your house would give me happiness, but I destroyed the only thing worth keeping, your trust. If you're reading this, I'm not asking for forgiveness for me. I'm asking you to forgive for your own sake, because anger is the heaviest burden good people ever carry." I set the letter down, my hands trembling. Daniel looked at me quietly. "Mom, are you going to write back?" I nodded. "Yes, not for her, but for me. It's time to close this chapter." That night, I sat at my desk and wrote, "Clara, thank you for your letter. Life isn't always fair, but it always offers a chance to begin again. I don't hold anger toward you anymore. I just hope you've learned that money can buy comfort, but never peace. When you leave that place, start over, clean and honest. If you need help finding work, I'll help. But remember, everything must begin with truth. Wishing you peace, Margaret Hayes." I sealed the envelope and mailed it the next morning. When I watched the postman walk away with it, a strange lightness filled my chest, as if someone had just unlocked the cage around my heart. Weeks passed quietly. Daniel sometimes told me about work, about the solar project he was helping design. I listened, smiling, thinking how proud Edward would have been to see his son finally grow into his own. Then one evening, Daniel came to me again. "Mom," he said, "I want to sell the condo Clara and I bought. I don't want to keep any part of that life. I want to use the money for something good." I tilted my head. "What do you have in mind?" "I want to start a scholarship, the Edward Hayes Foundation, to help young engineering students who can't afford tuition. Maybe that's how I make peace with the past." Tears filled my eyes. "You've truly grown, Daniel." Months later, the foundation was launched. The opening ceremony took place right here, in this house, once filled with tears, now echoing with laughter. Reporters came, but this time I stayed behind the scenes. I stood quietly behind the curtain as Daniel gave his speech. "This is the home where I learned the two greatest lessons of my life, that trust is a gift we should never take for granted, and that sometimes forgiveness is the only road to freedom." The crowd erupted in applause. I stood still, tears streaming, but this time they were tears of pride. That night, after everyone had left, Daniel sat beside me on the porch. "Mom," he said softly, "I just got word. Clara's been granted early release. I don't know if you'd want to see her." I was quiet for a moment, then replied, "If she truly wants to start over, I won't stand in her way. but she must come with honesty, nothing less. Daniel nodded silently. The porch light glowed over the garden of white roses Edward once planted. They had survived every storm, and now they bloomed again. I stepped closer, brushing my fingers against a dew-soaked petal. I understood then. Peace never arrives easily. It must travel through betrayal, loss, and pain. But that's what makes it sacred when it finally comes back. I sat down on the porch, watching the moonlight shimmer across the river, and in that silence, I whispered a single wish that no matter how loud the world becomes tomorrow, this house, our home, will always remain the one place where quiet still means strength and peace still belongs. One early summer morning, sunlight streamed through the window, scattering soft gold across the wooden floor. I sat on the porch with a cup of mint tea, breathing in the salty air drifting from the river. Everything seemed calm again, yet somewhere deep inside, I felt it. A quiet pull, a sense that another chapter was waiting to begin. About a week later, Daniel knocked on my door, holding an envelope. "Mom," he said slowly, "Clara wrote to you. She's been granted parole, and she wants to see you." I looked up at him. His eyes held both worry and hope. "Do you think I should see her?" I asked. He hesitated. "I think this time she means it." I set my cup down. Whether she's sincere or not, I want to look her in the eyes, to see if there's anything left inside me that still needs letting go. That afternoon, Clara arrived. She wore a simple white blouse, her hair cut short, her face stripped of pride. Her steps were cautious, almost shy. I opened the door and invited her in. We sat facing each other in the living room, the same room that had witnessed every storm this family ever weathered. She spoke first, her voice trembling. "Thank you for seeing me. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted to apologize. One last time." I studied her face. The arrogance was gone. What I saw instead was defeat, not by others, but by herself. "I once trusted you like my own daughter," I said quietly. "But you didn't just break my trust in you. You made me doubt my own instincts." Clara lowered her head. "I know. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I've changed. In the facility, I taught literacy to other women. I learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to appreciate the smallest things." I didn't answer right away. My eyes wandered around the room, once filled with shouting, tears, and lonely nights. Now, sunlight streamed through the windows, glinting off an old photo of Edward and little Daniel. I exhaled slowly. "If you truly want to start over," I said, "do something good for someone else. Not to repay me, to prove you've become different." Tears welled in her eyes. "I will. And if you'll let me, I'd like to begin by restoring your rose garden. It used to be your pride, didn't it?" I paused, then smiled softly. "If that's what you want, go ahead. Flowers always find a way to bloom again after the storm." And so, from that day on, Clara returned each morning. She didn't talk much, just worked quietly, digging soil, watering, planting. Daniel helped, and I watched from the porch. They spoke little, but in that silence, something unseen began to heal. One afternoon, Daniel called out, "Mom, come look!" Under the trees, the first roses had blossomed, red, yellow, and white. The sight took my breath away. Amid the fragrance, Clara approached me, her voice trembling. "I don't know if you'll believe me, but this is the first time I feel truly alive." I nodded gently. "Then keep living that way, Clara. Everyone gets a second chance, but peace only comes when we owe nothing, not even to ourselves." In the days that followed, Clara volunteered at Daniel's scholarship foundation. She refused payment, just wanted to help. I didn't interfere, but I watched from afar, in the way she greeted people, in how she tended the small potted plants by the porch. I saw it. Change. Real change. Time passed, and the house by the river came back to life. Laughter returned to its rooms, soft, genuine.
Olivia often stopped by with fresh-baked apple pie, teasing me. See, life always finds its surprises. Who would have thought your ex-daughter-in-law would be planting roses for you? I laughed. Sometimes redemption comes from the very person who once caused the hurt. One evening, when everyone had gone home, I sat alone on the porch. The wind carried the heavy scent of roses. I took an old photograph from my pocket. Edward, Daniel, and me, beside our first rosebush. Edward's eyes, frozen in that moment, were as kind as ever. I whispered, "Do you see, Edward? Everything's found its place again. Not perfect, but peaceful." The full moon shone bright, lighting every dew-soaked petal in silver. I closed my eyes and let the wind brush my face. For the first time in years, I felt no need to defend myself. No fear of loss, no trace of anger. Daniel stepped outside, draping a shawl over my shoulders. "Mom," he said softly, "Dad would be proud." I smiled. Not just your father, Daniel. I am too. We sat together in silence, listening to the water lapping at the shore. In the corner of the garden, Clara was still watering the flowers, the droplets glimmering like tiny stars beneath the moonlight. And I thought, maybe life is exactly like this. It never gives us a perfect ending. But if we're brave enough to face it, it offers something even better, a new beginning, gentler and truer than before. That night, I wrote in my old journal, "Today, my home is finally at peace. No longer a place of conflict or loss, but a home of forgiveness and renewal." If anyone asks me what peace is worth, I'll say, it costs a lifetime of learning how to let go. When I closed the journal, I knew my story had reached its true ending. Not one of tears or vengeance, but of something far more precious. Peace had finally stayed. And so, the story of Mrs. Margaret Hayes comes to a close, not with tears nor with bitterness, but in the gentle light of peace and forgiveness, from a mother betrayed by her own daughter-in-law. Pushed to the edge of losing both her home and her dignity, she chose to stand up, not for revenge, but for her self-worth. Through every storm, she learned that justice doesn't only live in courtrooms, but also in the courage to speak the truth and the grace to forgive. The riverside house that once held so much pain has become a symbol of rebirth, a place where a woman dared to face her wounds, let go, and turn pain into strength. Clara, the daughter-in-law who once fell, found herself again through work and repentance, and Daniel, the son who once faltered, finally learned that real love is not about control, but about respect. Mrs. Margaret's story is more than a family tragedy. It's a mirror for anyone who's ever been hurt under their own roof. It reminds us that forgiveness is not weakness. It is the highest form of courage. Loss is not an ending. It is the beginning of renewal. And peace, that quiet, simple thing, is the most precious treasure left after every storm. If you've ever carried scars like hers, remember this: no one can steal your dignity or your faith in yourself. Justice may arrive late, but it always finds those who never give up. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If Mrs. Margaret's journey touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share this video to spread a message of faith, forgiveness,
and the power of kindness. See you in the next story, where lives that seemed broken will once again find their light.